They say water remembers. Not in the way our minds remember birthdays or faces, but in the way it holds on to things. Weight, shape, silence. This lake, hidden deep in the folds of rural America, has been holding its breath for over 40 years. It does not shimmer like a postcard scene, nor welcome picnics and laughter along its banks. It is a dark mirror, framed by skeletal pines, their branches leaning toward it like quiet witnesses. The locals call it Marrow Lake, a name with no official origin, though everyone here seems to have a different story for it. Some say it's because the water runs so cold it seeps into your bones. Others claim it's because of what's buried beneath it, things no one talks about for too long. In the early mornings, when the fog lays thick like wool, the lake becomes a living thing, breathing in the mist, exhaling a stillness that feels almost unnatural. Fishermen who cast their lines here rarely look straight at the center. They say that's where the shadows move, even when the wind is still. The old-timers will warn you, don't swim too far out. Don't call out to anyone you hear on the water. And if you drop something in Marrow Lake, let it go. For decades, this body of water has been the backdrop for whispers in town. Whispers about couples who rowed out but didn't row back. About sudden storms that seemed to form directly above it, as if summoned from beneath. And about a single summer long ago, when a whole family disappeared after a drive toward its shore. On the surface, it is just another forgotten lake in an unremarkable corner of the country. No grand hotels. No bustling docks. Just a cracked boat ramp, a sagging wooden pier, and the occasional ripple cutting across its black skin. But if you've lived here long enough, you know, Marrow Lake keeps things. And it never gives them back whole. In the late 1970s, this place had been the site of quiet rebellions. Teenagers snuck beers on its banks under the cover of night. Lovers carved initials into the bark of trees and swore forever. By the early 80s, it had grown quieter. A few drownings. A few hushed police visits. Stories that never made the local paper but traveled by word of mouth until they became part of the lake's legend. The sheriff at the time, now long retired, once said in an unguarded moment at the diner, "It's not the water that scares me. It's what the water hides for you." He wouldn't elaborate. He didn't have to. In this town, half-truths carry more weight than confessions. It is the kind of place where the past feels thick in the air, where sound travels in strange ways. Stand at the pier at dawn, and you might swear you hear a motorboat on the far side, even when there's nothing there. Drop a stone into the water, and the splash seems swallowed instantly, the ripples fading too fast. It's as though the lake is impatient to return to stillness. And yet, for all its unease, there's a beauty here. The kind that draws photographers, painters, and now in recent years, drone operators. They come for the symmetry of fog on water, the way the morning sun slices through the mist like glass, the solitary silhouettes of pine trees standing sentinel. But the camera never captures the feeling that comes with standing on the shore, that quiet nudge at the back of your mind that something is watching from beneath. In the summer of 1983, the Holloway family drove toward this very lake. No one saw them arrive. No one saw them leave. And for 42 years, the lake has kept their story in perfect silence. That is, until one morning, not so long ago, when a hobbyist's drone swept low over its surface and caught a glint. A glint that didn't belong to water, or stone, or driftwood. A glint that should have been impossible after all these years. The kind of glint that pulls you forward, even when some part of you knows you're about to see something you can never unsee. If you stand at the shoreline now, you can almost imagine the lake remembering the moment it was found out, the morning it realized that the thing it had been keeping was about to surface. And in that moment, its long silence cracked, and the first ripple in decades began to spread. This is where our story begins, with a lake that doesn't speak, and the first whisper it has uttered in 42 years. The morning began with the kind of light that only comes after a night of heavy rain, soft, pale, and slightly bruised around the edges. The kind of light that makes colors feel muted, as though the world is still waking up. Ryan Caldwell wasn't supposed to be at Marrow Lake that day. At least, not in any grand, premeditated sense. He had packed his drone in the back of his pickup, planning to catch some sunrise shots over the valley. But a low bank of fog had swallowed the ridgeline, and he decided, on a whim, to head toward the lake instead. He wasn't a filmmaker. Not a detective. Just a man with a hobby, a camera, and a quiet fascination for landscapes no one bothers to photograph anymore. Ryan parked by the crooked boat ramp, the gravel crunching under his tires. When he stepped out, the air was damp and cool, with that faint metallic tang you get near deep water. The lake was flat as glass. No wind. No movement. Just a low mist drifting lazily over its surface. He set the drone on the hood of his truck, the plastic casing beaded with tiny droplets. The controller hummed to life in his hands, a low whir, then a higher pitch as the blades began to spin. The sound felt out of place here, almost disrespectful, like a small machine intruding on a place that preferred to be left alone. The drone lifted off, climbing above the shoreline. On his screen, the tree lane spread out like an oil painting. Greens and grays smudged together, the lake at the center like a black coin in the earth. For a while, Ryan simply drifted, letting the drone trace the shoreline, its camera panning slowly across weathered docks and half-sunken rowboats left to rot in the reeds. Then, near the western cove, something caught his eye. It was faint at first. Just a flicker of light beneath the surface, gone almost as soon as it appeared. He eased the drone lower, tilting the camera straight down. The cove was shallow here, the water a murky green-brown that light could barely penetrate. Beneath it, half concealed by layers of silt and algae, was a shape. A long, angular shape. Too regular to be rock. Too rigid to be driftwood. Ryan frowned, zooming in. The water distorted the image, making it shimmer and warp like a mirage. But there, a curved arc of metal. A roofline. A faint, unmistakable glint where the sun caught on something that had no business being there. He felt his pulse quicken. He lowered the drone further, his thumbs moving instinctively, the way you do when you know you're seeing something rare. And then, clear as a photograph, it came into focus. A car. Not just any car, but one trapped in a strange stillness, the way things look in dreams. Perfectly preserved and impossibly wrong in its setting. Its paint, once bright, was dulled to the color of old pennies. The windows were clouded, opaque with algae. It was angled slightly nose down, as though frozen in the act of sinking. Ryan leaned closer to the controller screen, his breath fogging the glass. Something about the shape gnawed at his mind. It felt familiar. The logical part of him said to back away, to fly the drone back, pack up, and pretend he'd never seen it. But curiosity is rarely logical. He circled the drone slowly over the wreck, the camera sweeping across the roof. On the rear window, almost invisible under the film of silt, was the faint outline of a faded decal. A yellow sunflower. He didn't know why that detail made his chest tighten. Only later would he learn that, in the summer of 1983, the Holloway family station wagon had a sunflower decal on the back window, placed there by the youngest daughter. Ryan swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe evenly. The drone hovered in place, its camera steady on the submerged car. He could see the outline of the open driver's side window, the interior swallowed by darkness. A breeze rippled the surface above it, breaking the image into fragments. For a moment, it looked like the car was disappearing again, retreating into the depths. Ryan pulled the drone back, his hands shaking. His mind was already racing through possibilities. Accident, theft, dumping ground. But deep down, under the rational noise, there was a colder truth forming. Whatever had happened here had been waiting to be found. As he packed up, he glanced once more at the lake. The surface was calm again, almost smug, like it knew he had just been given the smallest piece of a puzzle, and nothing more. He didn't yet realize that the discovery was about to tear open a 42-year-old wound in this town. That soon, the Holloway name would be on every local news broadcast. And that inside that car there was something more damning than bones. There were tapes. And they were still waiting to be heard. In the summer of 1983, the air was thick with the scent of cut grass and gasoline. It was the kind of small-town season where time felt slow, where every weekend was a repeat of the last. Barbecues, little league games, corner store popsicles melting faster than you could eat them. And in the middle of that gentle rhythm was the Holloway family. Thomas Holloway, 39, carried himself like a man whose dreams had been delayed but never abandoned. He worked as an electrical technician at a factory 2 towns over, but he always spoke, in that half-serious, half-someday tone, about opening his own recording studio. Music was the thing that softened him, gave his otherwise quiet demeanor a spark. Sometimes, when he thought no one was listening, he'd sit at the family's upright piano and play melodies that seemed to hang in the air long after his fingers left the keys. Linda Holloway, 36, was his opposite in energy. Always moving, always narrating life through the lens of her beloved camcorder. Her friends used to joke she'd been born with a camera in her hands. Even her grocery trips became short films. The kids pushing the cart down the aisle, the sound of a clerk's laughter as he bagged their items. The family's home movies were filled with small moments no one else would have thought to keep, yet Linda preserved them all. Then there were the children, 11-year-old Sophie, with her restless curiosity and tendency to ask the kind of questions adults rarely answer, and 8-year-old Michael, who seemed to live entirely in his imagination, forever building forts and whispering to action figures about grand, invisible adventures. The last week they were seen alive began like any other. On Monday, Linda filmed the kids helping Thomas wash the car in the driveway. The sun was bright, the car radio played a tinny pop song, and the air smelled faintly of hose water and soap. Somewhere in the background of the tape, a neighbor's dog barked endlessly. On Wednesday, Sophie convinced her father to take them to the gas station after dinner for ice cream bars. The station's fluorescent lights flickered, and the cashier, a lanky teenager with a mop of hair, joked about how he hadn't seen Thomas in weeks. Linda caught the whole exchange on tape. When she replayed it later, she noticed something odd in the reflection of the glass cooler door. A man in a dark jacket appeared to be standing outside near their car. She didn't remember seeing him at the time. Friday came with a humid heat that clung to the skin. That evening, Linda told her sister over the phone that they'd be driving to a friend's lake house the next day. She mentioned the kids were excited for a weekend away from the noise. Her sister later recalled that Linda's tone had been warm, but a little too brisk, like she was speaking with one eye on the clock. On Saturday morning, the family loaded up the station wagon. The back seat was cluttered with towels, a cooler, a pair of fishing rods, and Linda's ever-present camcorder case. Michael stuck a sunflower decal to the rear window, a small rebellion against his mother's rule about keeping the glass clear. Linda laughed, filming him as he smoothed the sticker with both hands. The last confirmed sighting came from Earl Danner, who ran the only diner between their neighborhood and the lake. He remembered them stopping in for pie around 2 p.m. Sophie had ordered cherry. Michael had gone to the restroom twice, each time dragging his shoes like they were too heavy. Thomas had sat near the window, glancing out more than he looked at his plate. When Earl cleared their table, he noticed a folded map with a faint coffee ring on it. It was marked with a route that didn't follow the main road to the lake. It veered off, hugging the shoreline in a way locals knew was slower, narrower, and less traveled. The Holloways were gone before Earl could ask about it. By sunset that night, the weather had shifted. The local radio issued a storm advisory for the area surrounding Merrow Lake, warning of sudden wind gusts and heavy rain. The Holloways never arrived at their friend's cabin. When they were reported missing 2 days later, search teams combed the main roads, the wooded trails, even parts of the lake's perimeter. But no vehicle was ever found. No skid marks. No debris. Just the still, indifferent water, and a silence that thickened with each passing day. The case remained open but stagnant, gathering dust in the police archives. Every few years, a tip would surface, a supposed sighting in another state, a man claiming to have heard voices by the water one night. But each lead dissolved as quickly as it appeared. In time, the Holloways became less a family and more a ghost story. Parents told their children not to wander near the lake after dark. Teenagers dared each other to leave flowers at the pier. And the sunflower decal became a strange, almost mythical symbol in town, a reminder that some things vanish whole, without explanation. For 42 years, their absence lingered like humidity in August. And then, a drone camera caught the glint of metal beneath the western cove. A shape. A station wagon. And in the blurred outline of the rear window, the faintest trace of a sunflower. By the time the first sheriff's cruiser arrived at Merrow Lake, the mist had burned off, leaving the water bare and exposed under a pale, cloud-smeared sky. Ryan Caldwell stood near his truck, replaying the drone footage on a loop. Each time, that glint of submerged metal seemed sharper, more undeniable. 2 deputies leaned over his shoulder, their brows tightening. Within the hour, more vehicles appeared: the county dive team's van, a flatbed tow truck, a battered utility crane riding low on its tires. By mid-morning, the shoreline had drawn a quiet crowd. Curious locals, fishermen, and a few older faces who remembered the Holloway's disappearance all too well. The dive team suited up with slow, deliberate movements, neoprene squeaking under their hands. One of them, a man named Porter, had been a boy when the Holloways vanished. He avoided the press, but his expression carried the weight of someone about to step into the past. Ryan watched as the divers slipped into the water, their movements sending dark ripples across the cove. The surface swallowed them quickly, until only the bright buoys of their air hoses marked their presence. For a while, the lake was silent, except for the faint hiss of oxygen tanks and the occasional call from shore. Then, a voice crackled over the diver's radio. "We've got contact." Confirming, "It's a vehicle." The crowd shifted. Someone exhaled sharply, as though holding their breath until now. It took nearly an hour to secure the tow straps. The divers worked by touch, scraping away decades of silt to find solid anchor points on the frame. When they finally surfaced, their masks were smeared with algae, their eyes unreadable behind the glass. The crane's engine coughed to life, the cables groaning as they tightened. At first, nothing happened. The water resisted, clinging to its secret like a jealous keeper. Then, slowly, agonizingly, the lake yielded. A ghostly silhouette rose from the depths, trailing a shroud of silt and weeds. The station wagon's roof broke the surface first, shedding water in long, steady streams. Its paint was no longer the bright factory color it once wore. It had faded to a dull, mottled bronze. The windshield was clouded, opaque, like the blind eyes of something that had been under too long. As the vehicle emerged fully, the scale of its preservation was chilling. Barnacles clung to the wheel wells. A child's sun-faded sandal was lodged in the roof rack. And there, on the rear window, faint but unmistakable, was the sunflower decal. Someone in the crowd murmured, "That's them." No one corrected it. When the car settled on the flatbed, the lake water streamed off in rivulets, pooling darkly on the gravel. The smell was a mix of rust, algae, and something older, a metallic tang that caught in the throat. The sheriff stepped forward, peering through the side glass. It was murky inside, the seats furred with algae. Shapes could be made out, but nothing was clear enough to name. The decision was made to open it on site. Forensics teams moved in with cameras, gloved hands, and an unspoken solemnity. The first door resisted, the seal fused tight by 4 decades underwater. When it finally gave, the hinges wailed like something in pain. The interior was a strange tableau of preservation and ruin. Waterlogged toys rested where they'd last been dropped. A rusted thermos lay tipped over on the floor. The fabric of the seats had dissolved in patches, revealing the skeletal frames beneath. But it was what they found in the front passenger footwell that stilled every hand: a weathered semi-transparent plastic case. Inside, 3 small VHS-C camcorder tapes, their labels faded but still legible in Linda Holloway's looping handwriting. The lead forensic officer lifted the case carefully, water dripping from the seams. He glanced at the sheriff. No one said it out loud, but every person within earshot felt the same pulse of realization. If these tapes had survived, they might contain the last recorded moments of the Holloway family. Ryan stood apart from the crowd now, the weight of the morning pressing down on him. The adrenaline of discovery had ebbed, replaced by a colder, heavier awareness that he had just opened a door into a story that had been locked for 42 years. As the car was secured for transport, the lake returned to its usual stillness, its surface unbroken as though it had not just surrendered something it had guarded for half a lifetime. But those who knew Merrow Lake's reputation would say otherwise. They would say the lake hadn't surrendered anything. It had chosen to reveal it. And only when it was ready. The station wagon sat under the harsh fluorescence of the county evidence bay, its wet metal skin steaming faintly in the late afternoon heat. Every inch of it dripped onto the concrete, the sound echoing in the empty, high-ceilinged room like the slow tick of a clock. The forensics team had cordoned off the area with yellow tape, though no one here needed reminding to keep their distance. The car felt less like evidence and more like a casket. The plastic case sat on a stainless steel table beside it, a thin film of lake water still beating on its surface. Inside, the 3 VHS-C tapes looked almost ordinary, their black shells intact, the tiny reels of brown magnetic tape wound tight. Each had a handwritten label, the ink blurred but still readable. Holloway, June 1983. Holloway, July 1983. Holloway, August 1983. The last one had a smudge of something across its white sticker, a reddish-brown stain no one wanted to identify. Detective Marla Greer stood over them, her latex gloves squeaking as she picked one up. She was young enough not to have been on the force when the Holloways vanished, but old enough to have grown up hearing their name. To her, these weren't just tapes. They were time capsules, sealed moments from a summer that had ended too abruptly. "Can we even play these?" one of the techs asked, leaning in. "Not until they're dried, cleaned, and digitized," Greer replied, her voice low, as if the tapes could hear them. She set the cassette back into the case with care, like she was laying it in a cradle. Nearby, another tech cataloged the other contents of the car, a child's lunchbox with a faded superhero decal, a fishing reel, its line tangled and brittle, a Polaroid photo, its image so water-warped it was impossible to tell who or what it had once shown. The items were mundane, yet here they hummed with significance, each one a thread that might unravel the Holloway's last day. Greer found herself glancing at the August 1983 tape more than the others. It wasn't just the stain. It was the date. The Holloways disappeared on August 20th. Her mind kept circling the same question. What could have been so important or so dangerous that it ended up here, sealed in this car at the bottom of a lake? The sheriff arrived quietly, his boots squeaking against the damp concrete. He was a broad man in his 60s, carrying the wear of too many unsolved cases. He looked at the tapes, then at the station wagon. "I was a rookie when they went missing," he said, almost to himself. "I remember the search. The mother-sister came every day to the station, until she just stopped coming." He ran a hand along the roof of the car, his fingers trailing rust. "When we couldn't find the car, we assumed it was gone for good. Scrapped. Dumped somewhere far away. Never thought." He didn't finish. The decision was made to send the tapes to a state lab specializing in magnetic media recovery. Until then, they would be stored in a temperature-controlled vault, a place where the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Greer watched as a technician sealed the plastic case in a larger, padded container. It was carried out slowly, under the watch of 2 officers, as if they were escorting a witness rather than an object. But even before the tapes were played, they had already begun to work their effect. Word of their existence spread through the town faster than the official press release could catch up. By the time evening fell, the diner was buzzing with theories. Some swore the tapes would show nothing but family picnics and fishing trips, that the mystery would die with the first playback. Others were convinced the footage would capture the family's final moments. Proof of foul play, maybe even the identity of the man they had supposedly been seen arguing with that summer. In living rooms across town, people dug out their own dusty home movies, staring at them like they'd never considered what a camera might capture by accident. For Ryan Caldwell, the man who had first spotted the car, the day had taken on an unreal quality. He sat in his kitchen long after dark, the drone controller still on the table. Part of him wished he'd never flown over the cove. Another part couldn't stop replaying the image, the glint of metal, the angle of the car, the sunflower decal. Whatever was on those tapes, he knew it would change everything. The first tape clicked into the lab's playback deck with a soft mechanical whir. A technician pressed play, and for a moment the screen stayed black, the only sound the faint hiss of aged magnetic tape spinning through the machine. Then color bled in. A living room, sunlit through half-open blinds. A couch draped in a crocheted blanket. Children's drawings tacked unevenly to the wall. And there, in the center of the frame, was Sophie Holloway, 11 years old, sitting cross-legged on the carpet with a deck of playing cards. She looked up at the camera and grinned. Her voice came through, a little warped from age. "Mom, you're supposed to play too." Linda Holloway's laugh followed, warm, unself-conscious, the kind of laugh that fills a room. She moved the camera to include Thomas, seated at the dining table, leafing through a stack of papers. He gave a small wave, but his eyes didn't quite meet the lens. The date stamp in the corner read June 12, 1983. The early minutes of the tape felt like every home movie from the era. Birthdays, dinner at the kitchen table, Michael running through the yard with a towel pinned around his neck, pretending to be a superhero. There was a simple, unpolished joy to it. The camera lingered on moments that seemed mundane. Linda stirring a pot on the stove, Thomas asleep on the couch with the TV still on, Sophie braiding her hair by the hallway mirror. But as the tape progressed, tiny cracks began to show. In one clip, the family is in the backyard grilling hot dogs. Thomas stands at the grill, his back to the camera. Over the sizzle, Linda's voice can be heard asking him something about the man from work. Thomas doesn't answer right away. When he does, his voice is quiet enough that the microphone barely catches it. Not in front of the kids. Linda's laugh in that moment is different. Shorter, almost forced, before she turns the camera toward Michael, who's chasing a firefly. In another segment, the kids are playing on the driveway at dusk, drawing chalk outlines of hopscotch grids. The camcorder pans briefly toward the street, where headlights sweep past slowly, then pause. The vehicle is too far for the make and model to be clear, but the brake lights flare before it drives on. Linda's voice goes still for several seconds, the camera pointed at nothing in particular, before she clears her throat and turns back to the children. The tape ends with a clip from inside the family car. Thomas is driving, Linda is filming from the passenger seat, and the kids are in the back, singing along to the radio. The sun is low, casting gold across the windshield. Linda turns the camera on herself for a moment, her smile easy, but her eyes distracted, like she's listening for something under the music. The image warps briefly, the way old tapes sometimes do, before the screen goes black. When the playback stopped, the lab room stayed silent. Detective Greer leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "This is just the first tape," she asked quietly. The technician nodded. "Chronological order. We've got July next. But there's something about this one. It's not just random moments. It's selective." "What do you mean?" Whoever filmed this wasn't just letting the camera run. They were keeping certain things and leaving out others. That idea hung in the air. Because if the footage was curated, even subtly, it meant Linda might have been recording with a purpose. And if she was, it raised a question that none of them wanted to say out loud yet. Had she known something was coming? The tapes were more than just evidence now. They were a thread leading directly into the Holloway's private world, a world that was beginning to look less idyllic the closer they examined it. Late that night, Greer replayed the June tape alone in her office. She kept noticing details that felt off, the way Thomas's shoulders tensed when Linda mentioned work, how the camera seemed to sweep past open windows, almost checking what was outside, the sudden cuts in otherwise continuous moments, as if Linda had stopped recording for reasons that had nothing to do with battery life. It was the same warm family portrait everyone remembered, but there was a shadow just outside the frame. When she finally turned off the monitor, Greer felt the hollow quiet of her office press in. She made a note in her case file, June tape, possible surveillance element. Linda aware of potential threat. Cross-reference with neighbor statements from summer '83. She didn't write the rest of what she was thinking, that whatever was happening to the Holloways had already begun, and that July would tell them if it was getting closer. The second tape loaded with a faint click, the reels rolling forward like a slow inhale. The date in the corner read August 20th, 1983, the day the Holloways vanished. It began innocently enough. A bright kitchen morning, light spilling across the counter. Michael perched on a stool, eating cereal straight from the box, while Sophie braided her hair in the reflection of the toaster. Linda's voice was light, teasing Michael about saving some for the rest of us. Somewhere off camera, Thomas hummed a low, tuneful sound as he zipped up a cooler. The footage cut to the driveway. The station wagon stood ready, cooler in the back, fishing rods strapped to the roof rack, a folded picnic blanket tucked against the rear window. Michael was affixing the sunflower decal, pressing it onto the glass with both palms, until Linda told him, laughing, Okay, that's enough glue for one lifetime." Thomas appeared in the frame, checking the tires. He looked up at Linda for just a moment, The smile he gave her was thin, quick, and entirely gone before the camera adjusted focus. The next clip was filmed from inside the car. They were already on the road. Sunlight flickered through the trees in rhythmic bursts, the hum of the tires underscored by a faint song on the radio. Sophie leaned forward between the front seats, asking about the lake house. Thomas told her they'd be there by sundown. Linda panned the camera to the passing scenery. Wide fields, the occasional farmhouse, the flash of a small-town gas station. At one point, a black pickup appeared in the side mirror, following at a measured distance. Linda's camera lingered there for several seconds before cutting abruptly to a different angle. By late afternoon, the light had shifted. The road was narrower now, hemmed in by thick stands of pine. The air inside the car seemed warmer, heavier. Thomas spoke less, his hands tight on the wheel. At one point, Linda asked quietly, "Is he still there?" Thomas didn't answer. The camera turned briefly toward the rear window. The pickup was closer now, its headlights dull in the daylight, holding steady in their lane. Then came the diner. The Holloways pulled in, and Linda filmed from her seat as a waitress delivered pie to the table. It should have been a harmless stop, a roadside pause in a long drive, but even here something was wrong. Thomas kept glancing toward the window. When the camera swung in that direction, the black pickup was parked across the lot. Its driver wasn't visible. The footage cut mid-bite. Night had fallen in the next clip. The car was back on the road, the interior lit by the dashboard glow. Raindrops streaked the windshield, distorting the glare of oncoming headlights. Linda's voice was quieter now, almost a whisper. "If you think we should turn around," Thomas interrupted. Too late for that. The wipers beat a steady rhythm. Somewhere in the back, Michael asked if they were lost. No one answered. Then, faint but clear over the hum of the tires, came the sound of another engine. The pickup's headlights bloomed suddenly in the side mirror, brighter now in the darkness. It followed for miles, closing the distance whenever Thomas slowed. Linda shifted the camera toward the back again. Through the rain-smeared glass, the pickup's grille loomed, closer, closer, until its lights filled the frame. The storm intensified. The road dipped and curved, the trees pressing in like walls. Thomas muttered something about cutting across the cove, his voice tight with urgency. The camera jostled, catching flashes of road signs, their letters blurred by motion and rain. Then, without warning, the headlights behind them vanished. Just gone. For a beat, the only sound was rain on the roof. Sophie whispered, "Where'd he go?" Thomas didn't answer. He just kept driving, faster now. The last moments of the tape were the most unsettling. The camera caught the reflection of water, black and restless, appearing suddenly to their right. Linda's breathing quickened. She shifted the lens forward, capturing the flash of something in the middle of the road. It looked like a figure, just standing there facing the car. Thomas swerved. The camera jolted violently, catching a brief blurred glimpse of the guardrail, then the roar of water, then static. In the viewing room, no one spoke for several seconds after the tape clicked to a stop. Greer stared at the frozen last frame, an abstract smear of motion and light, as though looking long enough might make sense of it. "That's where it ends?" she asked. The technician nodded. "That's it for August except for what's on the third tape." Greer exhaled slowly. The second tape had shown enough to prove one thing beyond doubt. The Holloways hadn't simply gotten lost that night. Something or someone had been following them. And whatever happened next had happened on camera. The third tape was different before it even began. The plastic casing was cloudy, its edges rough where the lake had gnawed at it. A rust-colored smear marred the label, bleeding into Linda Holloway's handwriting until her looping A in August looked like it was sinking into the paper. When the state lab returned it, they warned Detective Greer, "This one's unstable. You'll get fragments. And what you do get won't be clean." The first seconds were nothing but static, a shifting snowstorm of gray punctuated by thin bands of warped color. Then, without warning, an image tore through. The inside of the station wagon, tilted at a strange angle. Light, strobing from outside, refracted and distorted as though passing through moving water. Someone, likely Linda, was holding the camera at arm's length, her face partly visible in the corner of the frame. Her expression was a mix of shock and calculation, her eyes darting between the lens and something just beyond it. The sound was warped, waterlogged. Voices were stretched thin, as if echoing from the bottom of a well. Thomas. Hold on, just hold on. Sophie, crying. It's cold. Michael, I can't. The camera jolted, revealing the windshield, cracked but intact. Beyond it, the murky green of lake water. Tiny particles floated past like drifting ash. Outside, something moved, not swimming, but shifting, slow and deliberate. Another glitch. The image dissolved into pixelated bands before snapping back to a view of Thomas. He was turned toward the back seat, one hand braced against the headrest, the other gripping Sophie's arm. His mouth was moving, but the words didn't sync with the audio. Somewhere in the background, faint but chillingly clear, was another voice, not one of theirs. Calm. Measured. Addressing Thomas by name. You didn't have to run. The words floated in the silence after, like something too heavy to sink. The footage fractured again, black for several seconds. Then an image reappeared. Linda was holding the camera tight to her chest now, filming in jagged panic movements. The lens caught flashes of the dashboard, the rear window, the dark water pressing in from all sides. Bubbles streamed upward, catching the weak light from somewhere above. Sophie's sobs turned into short, shallow breaths. Michael clutched something. It looked like a flashlight, though it wasn't turned on. Thomas was gone from the frame. The next clip lasted only a few seconds, but was the most haunting. The camera was facing upward toward the cracked seam of light far above. Something passed between it and the surface, a shape too large to be a person, moving with eerie steadiness. Linda's breathing quickened, and she whispered something into the microphone, almost too faint to hear. I'm sorry. The camera tilted sharply, hitting the floor. For a moment, the lens was pressed against the fabric of the seat, showing nothing but dark, wavering texture. Then, an abrupt shift. The view changed to outside the car. This final sequence didn't seem possible. The angle was from several feet away, as though the camera had been set down or was drifting free. The station wagon was visible in full now, nose down, sinking deeper into the green-black water. The open driver's side window framed the dark interior like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Inside, movement. Arms. Hands. Faces, barely lit by the thin silver from above. For a split second, Linda's face turned toward the camera. Her mouth opened. Maybe to call out, maybe just to breathe. But before anything could be heard, the image warped into a blur of bubbles and light, and then static. The room where they watched it stayed silent long after the tape ended. Greer sat with her elbows on her knees, staring at the blank monitor, her pulse in her ears. No one said what they were all thinking, that someone else had been there in those final moments, and that, if the camera had truly been outside the car, someone or something had put it there. The lab's report would later describe the footage as inconclusive, but for those who had seen it, there was nothing inconclusive about the terror on the Holloway's faces. The tape hadn't solved the mystery. It had deepened it, pulled it into a place where no amount of forensic analysis could fully follow. And for Detective Greer, it had given her one more certainty. The Holloway's last moments were witnessed, and the witness was still unnamed. By the next morning, the Holloway case was no longer a quiet local mystery. It was a live wound. The sheriff's office hadn't even released an official statement before the story began to spread. First at the diner, then in the grocery store, and by noon across the entire county. The words traveled in fragments. Car found in lake. Tapes inside. They saw something before they died. At the diner, a group of older men leaned over their coffee cups, voices low but urgent. One swore the Holloway's disappearance had been tied to Thomas's job, that he'd stumbled onto something at the factory that certain people didn't want aired. Another claimed to remember a man in a black jacket asking about the family a week before they vanished. They argued about the pickup truck on the tape, what make it might have been, who in town had owned one like it back then. In the grocery store, two women in the baking aisle whispered about Linda's August footage. One said the unknown voice sounded familiar, though she couldn't place it. The other said it was pointless to guess. If it was who I think, they've been gone for years. Or buried somewhere you won't find them. A clerk stocking shelves nearby pretended not to listen but later told a friend the voice on the tape had the kind of calm you only get from knowing you're in control. The younger generation, those who hadn't been alive in 1983, took to social media. Short clips from the digitized June and July tapes were shared out of context. Michael's sunflower decal, Sophie's hopscotch drawings, paired with ominous captions. The hashtags #Holloway tapes and #Marrow started trending in the state. Some of the posts claimed to enhance the third tape, pointing out shapes in the murky water that looked like hands or faces. Others insisted the voice that spoke Thomas's name was a trick of the damaged audio. The arguments only fueled more interest. For Detective Greer, the noise was both a curse and a tool. Theories had to be sifted through carefully. Most were built on rumor, but every so often, a detail would surface that wasn't public knowledge. One man called in, claiming he'd been fishing at Marrow Lake the night of August 20th and heard two cars racing down the North Access Road. When Greer asked why he hadn't come forward in 1983, he said simply, "Nobody wanted to talk about that place back then." The town's older residents understood Marrow Lake had always been a place where stories collected like silt. A few were harmless. Tales of phantom lights, whispers on the water. But others were not for tourists. Some remembered that in the early 1980s, a stretch of land near the western cove had been bought up by a shell company no one could trace. Construction had started, then stopped abruptly. The half-built dock was left to rot, its pilings disappearing beneath the water over time. It was in that same cove, decades later, that the drone had found the Holloway's car. The more the tapes were discussed, the more they became a mirror for the town's collective guilt. Everyone seemed to have a theory about what had happened. Few were willing to admit that maybe, just maybe, someone still living knew the truth. Late one evening, Greer sat alone in her office, reviewing her notes. Theories filled the margins. Accident/cover-up. Holloway swerved, fell in, locals hid it to avoid bad press. Targeted, Thomas owed money, followed to the lake. Wrong place, wrong time. Family stumbled into someone else's crime. Inside job, someone they knew invited them to the cove. Each theory had its holes. Each theory explained just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to settle anything. Greer knew that until they identified the unknown voice, they had no solid ground. But the voice wasn't the only haunting thing about the third tape. She couldn't stop thinking about that impossible final angle. The one from outside the car. The one that suggested someone had been there, filming them as they sank. If that someone was still alive, they'd had 42 years to decide what else to keep hidden. The phrase first appeared on the June tape, Linda's voice casual but edged with something else. The man from work. At the time, it could have meant anything. A coworker, a client, a repairman passing through. But once the August and third tapes were recovered, the words took on a weight that wouldn't go away. Detective Greer started digging into Thomas Holloway's employment records. In 1983, he'd been working at Kellerman Industrial, a mid-size electrical components plant on the outskirts of town. The company had changed hands twice since then, but old payroll ledgers were still in storage. Dusty boxes with curling file labels. One name kept surfacing alongside Thomas's in shift schedules and work orders: Raymond Vance. 41 years old in '83, Vance had been a foreman in the assembly wing. His file contained the basics: address, emergency contact, attendance logs. But what drew Greer's attention was a note in the margin of his personnel review: prone to conflict with subordinates. Multiple complaints of intimidation. Resolved internally. Greer traced Vance's employment timeline. He'd left Kellerman abruptly in September 1983, barely 2 weeks after the Holloways vanished. No forwarding address. No resignation letter. Just gone. His last recorded paycheck had been collected in cash. The sheriff remembered Vance. Said he'd been the kind of man who could fill a doorway and make you feel it. Not loud. Not sloppy. Just deliberate. Back then, Kellerman was one of the county's biggest employers. When the Holloways disappeared, the factory was under pressure from a lucrative government contract. The sheriff admitted reluctantly that they'd been told to keep disruption minimal during the investigation. Translation: no dragging Kellerman's name through the mud unless they had a body or a confession. There were whispers that Vance had been seen near Merrow Lake in the weeks before the disappearance. One former employee, now retired, told Greer about a night when Thomas had stayed late working on something sensitive. Vance had been in the break room, leaning against the counter, watching Thomas with the kind of stillness that wasn't casual. When the man telling the story reached this part, he stopped and looked at Greer. "You know, some people don't watch you because they like you. They watch you because they're figuring out how to move you." Digging deeper, Greer found that Vance had a criminal record predating his time at Kellerman. Assault charges in another county, a bar fight that left a man with a broken jaw. None of it had stuck. Witnesses went missing, cases were quietly dropped. And then there was the connection no one had noticed before. Vance's brother-in-law had owned the shell company that briefly held title to that half-built dock on Merrow Lake's western cove. The voice on the third tape wasn't crystal clear, but Greer couldn't shake how it sounded. Low, steady, unhurried. Exactly the way multiple former employees described Vance when he was angry. The problem was, if he was the man from work, he'd been gone for decades. No confirmed sightings since 1984. No records of death. No trace in the Social Security database. One theory, whispered by a former deputy over drinks, was that Vance had left on someone else's dime, that the Holloway's disappearance hadn't been a lone act of violence, but part of a job, a removal. If that was true, it would explain why his name had stayed out of official reports. It would also mean that whatever Thomas had known or recorded on those tapes had been dangerous enough for someone to make sure it never surfaced. Greer knew she couldn't hang the whole case on a dead or missing man. But the trail to Vance wasn't cold. It had been frozen deliberately, like the car in the lake. And now, 42 years later, it was starting to thaw. The viewing room at the county building was small, its only window covered by blinds that hadn't been opened in years. The walls were painted a muted beige, the kind of color chosen to calm people who were about to see things they'd never forget. A flat-screen monitor sat at the front, cables coiled neatly on the table beneath it. 3 chairs faced it, arranged in a row, too close together for comfort, too far apart for true closeness. Detective Greer entered first, followed by 2 women in their 60s. One was Margaret Hayes, Linda Holloway's younger sister. The other, Eleanor Marks, was Thomas's cousin. Both had been in their early 20s when the Holloways vanished. Neither had spoken much on the drive here. Margaret carried a small bundle in her hands, a neatly folded blue cardigan. It wasn't until they sat down that Greer realized it was Linda's, preserved for 42 years. "This is the only time these tapes will be shown outside of the investigation," Greer said quietly. "They're digitized, but you'll be seeing them exactly as we recovered them. No edits." Margaret's hands tightened around the cardigan. Eleanor nodded, her jaw set. The lights dimmed. The screen lit up. First, the warm June footage. Children's laughter, lazy afternoons, the sunflower decal being pressed onto the car window. Margaret smiled faintly at Sophie's voice, her lips forming silent words in sync with her niece's. When Thomas appeared, Eleanor leaned forward slightly, as if trying to read something in his eyes. July passed in minutes. Fishing trips, ice cream stops, brief shots of the house. But each time Linda's voice mentioned the man from work, Margaret's shoulders stiffened. "She knew something," Margaret murmured. "She didn't tell me, but I can see it now. She was keeping watch." Then came August. The diner stop. The black pickup in the parking lot. The long, rain-slick road. Margaret's knuckles whitened on the cardigan. Eleanor's hand moved to her mouth when the headlights loomed in the mirror. When the camera jolted toward the figure in the road, Margaret whispered, "Oh God!" Her voice cracked, and she shut her eyes until the screen went black. And then the third tape. The room seemed to shrink as the warped, waterlogged images filled the screen. Linda's face, pale and urgent. Thomas's voice, shouting through distortion. Sophie crying, her small hands clinging to her brother. Margaret began to weep softly, rocking slightly as if to soothe someone who wasn't there. Eleanor stayed silent, but her breathing grew shallow. When the unknown voice came through, that low, deliberate, "You didn't have to run," Margaret froze. Her head turned sharply toward Greer. "That voice," she said. "It's familiar." She didn't elaborate. She didn't have to. Greer could see it in her face, the pull of recognition, the fear of saying it out loud. The impossible final shot appeared, the car sinking, filmed from outside. Margaret's tears came harder. Eleanor stared, her lips pressed into a thin line. Neither woman looked away until the screen went black for the last time. The lights came back on. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Margaret folded the cardigan carefully back into her lap. "She was trying to leave us a message," she said softly. "Not just for you, detective. For me. For Michael and Sophie. She wanted us to see." Eleanor spoke for the first time since the tape had started. "That voice," she said. "It wasn't some stranger from the highway." Greer waited. Eleanor's eyes flicked toward the floor. It was someone they knew. They didn't say the name. But Greer knew it was now only a matter of time before she asked them directly. For now she let the silence sit, a fragile, heavy thing. The Holloway family's last moments had been seen by strangers, investigators, and now by the only blood they had left. And yet, the lake still held the rest. Merrow Lake was quiet again. The cables, the divers, the floodlights, all gone. Only the water remained, still as dark glass under a moon the color of old bone. On the surface, there was no sign that a car had ever been lifted from its depths. No trace that the Holloway name had been spoken here in 4 decades. The lake had gone back to the way it had always been. Waiting. From the pier, the air felt colder than it should in late summer. The pine trees along the shoreline leaned toward the water, as if trying to hear something. Every now and then, a ripple crossed the surface. Small, perfect, as though something beneath had stirred just enough to remind the world it was there. Some in town said the lake had given up its secret willingly. Others believed it had been forced, dragged into the open. And still others whispered that what was found was never the whole secret, that the tapes were just the part it was willing to share. Detective Greer stood at the edge of the pier, looking out into the black water. The investigation was far from over. The name Raymond Vance now sat heavy in her files, alongside the testimonies of 2 women who had recognized a voice they would not name. But she also knew something no case report could capture, that there was a rhythm here, something in the way the wind moved over the lake, in the way the night seemed to lean in when she was alone. The Holloways had been pulled from the water. The car, the tapes, the fragments of their final day, all accounted for. And yet, the truth still felt submerged. In town, the story had taken root again. Children dared each other to run to the pier after dark. Fishermen claimed they'd felt a sudden tug on their lines, as if something deep below had hooked them instead. An old man swore he'd seen lights under the water one night. 2 beams, side by side, moving slowly toward the western cove before vanishing. Theories multiplied, but answers didn't. On certain nights, when the mist lay low and the moon was a faint smear in the sky, the lake seemed to absorb sound. You could stand on the shore, call out, and hear nothing come back. No echo, no ripple, no acknowledgement. As if the lake was listening but choosing not to reply. Margaret Hayes came here once after the viewing. She didn't bring flowers. She didn't speak. She just stood at the end of the pier, cardigan folded in her hands, staring at the water until her eyes burned. Some say she whispered something into the wind before leaving. If she did, the lake kept it. Greer knew she would be back here too. Maybe not tonight, maybe not this year, but someday when the case felt further than it should. She imagined herself standing in the same spot, listening for something she couldn't name. Because here, the line between memory and myth was thin. Too thin. The lake had spoken once. 42 years of silence, then a single whisper, a glint of metal under a drone's camera. And now it had gone quiet again. Perhaps it had told all it wanted to tell. Or perhaps it was just waiting for the next name to sink beneath its surface. Fade to black.